Hi, welcome everyone. This is ModX Network Voices. My name's Ryan Smith. I want to welcome you out. Also, I'm joined by my partner, Ivan Rupnik.
Hey Ryan, how's it going?
Thanks for joining us again, Ivan. And our guest today is Mila Duncheva. Mila.
Hello everyone.
How you doing, Mila?
Yeah, really good, thanks. Greetings from Bonnie, Scotland.
Yes. Mila is going to give us a little introduction about herself, but she's been a long-time acquaintance and friend and has joined us on a number of ModX adventures and is a researcher in the space and also recently developed Offsite Ready, which is a training program and knowledge program in Scotland for the UK audience and getting them up to speed in offsite construction for various audiences. She'll talk more about that, but Mila, welcome, and please introduce yourself and share with us what you've been working on.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Really glad to be here. I'll just share my screen with the presentation slides. There we go. We can all see that now. So I'll just put it on full screen. So yeah, welcome. I'm going to talk about productivity management in offsite construction, currently based at Edinburgh Napier University in the Centre for Offsite Construction and Innovative Structures. Of course, who doesn't like to talk about themselves? So you can see a short version of my CV here. I guess what's quite interesting about me is that I started off with a very creative Bachelor of Arts degree in architecture from the University of Kent, where I got to develop, lots of funky ideas into real projects. And that's where I got really interested into timber construction, sustainable construction, as well as the more technical, almost the more architectural technology side of things. That's what then led me on to do a PhD at the University of Strathclyde, focusing on offsite construction, and recently I've been doing a little bit of mini MBA training just to get that commercial awareness as well. In the meantime, I've had a chance to work on quite a lot of interesting projects, and here you see when I was invited speaker in Boston at ModX. That was fantastic. But I guess the most recent one, which probably deserves almost a separate video, is the offsite construction sector capacity and productivity report, which I worked on with a number of colleagues within Edinburgh Napier University and the Glasgow School of Art. But the project that I worked on focused on, okay, what's the offsite sector in Scotland in terms of people employed, capacity, output, who are the main players, and how does the current state compare to 5 years previously, and what will it look like 5 years going into the future. And that's really built upon what I did in my PhD on offsite productivity. So all those experiences put together really mean that I've got a big variety of skills, kind of juggling lots of different things, all the way from Adobe InDesign and Illustrator, making creative graphics, to modular construction and in vivo qualitative data analysis, as well as chairing meetings, etc., from working with Offsite Solutions Scotland. So that's about me. But what I always love talking about is productivity. So what is productivity? I'll just run through these relatively quickly. Textbook definition is ratio of the product's output to the product's input. So all that means is that if the balance is in the right direction, if your input is lower than the output, then that means your productivity is good, and that also relates to a good quality of life if you look at the national statistics. So in offsite construction, let's say if you put in fewer labor hours to produce a meter squared floor area of a building, that's good. But then if you turn the ratio around, in which we're actually putting in a lot of effort and producing much less output, that results in lower productivity, and also the textbooks would say a low quality of life if you're looking at items such as GDP per full-time employee. But the OECD, as well as other indexes, acknowledge that, okay, quality of life is about more than gross domestic product per full-time employee. And that's part of why the OECD created this Better Life Index, in which you can go in and you can select, okay, so what's important for my quality of life? You can't create a blanket rule. So what's it like for me? So you can see here, I'm quite interested in good quality housing, a good level of income, the environment, and life satisfaction. Whereas things like community or other aspects are a little bit less important to me in various degrees. And based on that personalized inputs, I can see, okay, which are the best countries for me to live in to match up to the best quality of life for me personally. So you can see the places like the States, Norway are quite high up on that list according to these variables. And so offsite construction productivity is actually just as complex, if not even more, than quality of life. So that's part of why, I spent a number of years at the University of Strathclyde, supervised by Fiona Bradley at University of Glasgow, and went around lots of companies, lots of site visits, lots of factories to try and understand, okay, what is actually important about offsite construction productivity and how can we measure it? So I came up with this idea for a multi-factor productivity index, looking at variables that you see here on the side: specification, cost, build quality, labor, material waste, as well as build time. And all of these things are items which we often hear are benefits of offsite, but then how do we actually back that up, and how does that vary from project to project? So ultimately, what I would like to develop is an index similar to the Better Life Index, where people can put in what's important for me on this project. Is it about digitization and BIM? Is it about installation time? And then get an idea of which offsite construction system would be the most suitable for their personalized criteria. So let's say volumetric steel, this isn't very specific, but let's say they could see that volumetric steel with 85% completion in the factory could be very suitable for that project, whereas sub-assemblies made out of timber with only 10% of the work completed in the factory would not be that suitable to achieving my desired criteria. So that's the overall goal. That's how the different factors in offsite construction are interconnected. And I'm just going to talk you through, how I came to these conclusions. So I got the pleasure to go around 10 manufacturers based in the UK and mainland Europe who produced panelized and volumetric systems. And just for clarity, this is all based on timber, because I selected it as a natural material that can promote sustainability, etc. So this is all based on timber, can be expanded to other materials. And what was quite interesting about all these different companies, which you can see here in the columns, was the large variety of building types and associated business models that they had. So for example, if you look at the European manufacturers, especially the bigger ones, they actually excluded single-family houses from their business model at all, because that was not feasible. The market was oversaturated. Whereas in places like Scotland, single-family houses are actually a big part of the business model. So we can see lots of variation there. And it was also interesting to see quite a big uptake in aspects such as rooftop extensions, where offsite can offer clear advantages over traditional systems, as well as remote locations such as islands, etc. But the biggest thing for me to take away is really the big variety of building types, and therefore the need for that multi-factor approach. And here you can see some of the great projects that these companies have worked on, including some affordable houses like the Boklok you see here, rooftop extensions, and some more interesting kindergartens made entirely, all these funky designs made entirely using fully volumetric solutions. So there's no limitations, especially to offsite. So now getting into the productivity calculation side, it's quite important to consider the work completed in the factory so that you're not comparing apples with oranges. And so this is a way, this is a system which you can see that the UK panelized manufacturers, quite as expected, had a lower level of work completed in the factory. When you go to volumetric units, we see the EU volumetric people doing about 55% of the work in the factory, and the UK volumetric companies trying to do as much as possible. So about 70% of the work is completed in the factory. And I think that ultimately did impact on the results regarding labor productivity in terms of output per labor hour, considering the size of the workforce. So if we see the UK volumetric companies here, on average, their productivity was relatively low. And that had to do with the maturity of the market as well. But we have to remember that they were trying to do a lot of different tasks in construction, whereas people like the UK panelized and the EU volumetric companies performed very similarly. And what I noticed just by walking around as a general impression was that all these companies had a very clear definition of what they do. They were subcontracted, they only did A, B, C, and D, and that was it, very specialized. But yeah, so it shows that, you know, there's different levels of maturity in the UK, in the EU markets regarding these different systems. So that's the manufacturing side. Of course, the manufacturing then needs to translate into impact on the construction site. So without going into too much detail, here we've got a comparison of two projects, one using volumetric, very high level of work completed in the factory, and the other project using open timber panels, or one of the lowest levels of offsite, which you can get. So very similar projects in terms of size, clients, and year of completion. I'm just going to highlight a few things here. So let's say with regards to time, you'd expect the volumetric system to perform extremely well. We always see that as marketed benefits. But in this case, the volumetric project, which was quite innovative, was delayed by 52 weeks. And that had to do with that innovation aspect as well. Whereas the open timber panel was delayed by 12 weeks, which didn't cause much issues. The two projects did perform very similarly in terms of waste materials, with about 2.5 tons, and about 75% of that diverted from landfill. So in terms of waste, they were very similar. But in terms of installation time to get up to air and wind tight, the open timber panel was actually much slower than the volumetric timber construction, indeed by 40 times. It was 40 times slower. So in terms of achieving that immediate air, wind, and water tightness on site, you know, the volumetric system was definitely the winner. And there's lots of different criteria here that we can maybe pick up on in questions. So just some quick summary points. You know, it's really important to choose the productivity measures carefully and correctly. I know we whisked through them relatively quickly, but there's a lot of intricate technical aspects that need to be considered in those, and they really need to be focused around your priorities. You know, is it time, is it quality, which one of those is important, but also working very closely with the manufacturers and the supply chains to make sure that everything is coordinated, as well as planning the interface between the offsite and the onsite activities. You know, logistics can be definitely a make it or break it scenario. It's quite important to have that planned out very early on, as well as, you know, just not taking all the benefits that you hear about offsite construction systems at face value. You know, building up on what I just said, just plan the installation and follow on trades and the logistics in detail for every specific project. And, you know, when you do think about waste materials, don't only think about waste materials, but think also about things like waiting time for cranes. So in one project I saw, the crane was rented for the full day, but because of the number of modules on site, it could only be used for a fraction of that time. So whereas that waiting time for that crane, what's doing is wasting money essentially. But also skills underutilization. There's some great examples of people coming from the industry, such as the pastry or the cooking industry, and being exceptional in offsite construction. So, you know, make use of those skills as much as possible. And of course, some references to myself. If you do want to find out more, there's my thesis available online, and there's a journal paper in the Journal of Construction Engineering and Management by the ASCE. So yeah, that's it from me for now. And yeah, I'll open it up for the discussion afterwards.
Great.
Thanks, Mila. I'm going to move back into, there we go. We'll go into gallery mode here just to see each other. Really interesting work. I did a study a while back where we documented 17 case studies in a similar format, and we were trying to evaluate productivity. And the question of labor productivity came up. We certainly were able to calculate cost and schedule and the benefits associated with that. But the question of labor productivity came up. How did you calculate labor productivity? Was that hours per square foot or hours per square meter? How was that calculated, might I ask?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I really like talking about these things. So yeah, I think in the end I went for labor hours per meter squared of floor area, but there was the problem in which, so some companies, the labor hours are actually relatively straightforward to calculate. All you need is the number of people who worked and the shift pattern or the contractual hours per week. And then you just multiply those. So you get the labor input relatively easily. It's more difficult. That's easy to do in the factory. It's more difficult to do on site when you have various trades coming in and out, not always planned, etc. So, you know, that recording piece, almost that data capture piece on site is very critical. And I'm really hoping for things such as thumbprint technology to help with that, so you know who was on site for how much time. So yeah, in terms of the factories, I calculated it asking how many people worked there at any single time, what were the shift patterns, but on site there was a lot of, that's why I had so many site visits, basically going in every week and talking to the site managers, because they have this wealth of knowledge. You know, don't always rely on yourself, ask others. This wealth of knowledge on who was there, for what reason, what was delayed, and just capturing all of that. Now the output was a little bit more tricky, because some people measure their output in meters squared floor area, other measure it in meters squared of panels, and third people measure it in linear meters of panels. So converting all those units actually not very straightforward. What I ended up doing was getting, you know how in carbon calculations you have CO2 equivalents, and everything else relates to a measure of CO2. So similar to that, I got a living unit equivalent. So I just took a module which was in the public domain, you know, the plans were available, and I basically translated the output of each of those companies into how many of those modules would they make. So if it was, so if it was, let's say, for linear meters, if you know the height, the general height, you know, in the UK it's 2.4 meters for a general ceiling height, and then you can transform to meters squared quite easily. But yeah, that was quite tricky to calculate.
Well, it also shows your value system as a researcher, that the goal is to house people. And so the productivity needs to be measured in how many people can you house at the end of the day with your effort, right? As opposed to how much money you make, how much it costs, or other measures of productivity. It's really telling.
No, yeah, exactly. I think that's it. And to fit in that, I also decided to do that as a living unit. Mainly because on site, that's how people refer to them. They refer to them as units. They're never apartments. They're never houses. They're never, you know, anything like that. They're always units. So just keeping in tune with the language that people in construction management already use.
Yeah. And then I had another question. Sorry, Ivan, you wanted to ask a question. Let me just jump in with one more before you get going, if that's okay. One more question about your research. Really fascinating work. You had percentage of completion in the factory versus on site. How was that measured and taken into consideration? Was it a report from the companies that worked on it, or did you do the calculation? Was it based on percentage of cost or space or material? You know, how was that done?
Yeah, so I would have loved it if I had, the actual cost data, so I could say this much of the value was added in the factory, this much on site, because companies and projects tend to be quite, secretive about those things. So what I ended up doing was asking the companies during the interviews, during the visits, what would you estimate is the work you complete in the factory? And then you always get answers like, it's 95% done, etc. Everything is completed. We don't need to do anything on site. It's so perfect and wonderful. So what I ended up doing is just, going through the systems and the processes that they implement. And what I did, I just added a value of 1 to each element that they made. So if they made the frame, that was 1. If they also had the installation, that was 1 more. If they sometimes added the installation, but depending on the client, they didn't, that was a 0.5 attributed. So it was really like a point-based system. And then to calculate the percentage, I just took 100 as being all those things, all those items that people could add in the factory, but of course not everybody completed everything. So that's why we came up with things like, especially things like groundworks actually take a lot of the value of projects. So that's why I think that when people say 95% done in the factory, is that really the case when you consider the cost for the groundworks, etc. And as a final, verification, I went through the existing literature, being a PhD researcher, and just benchmarked against other people's statistics. So there was a really good book by Ogden Lawson from the Steel Construction Institute, who basically verified my numbers. So about 25% for panelized and around 70% for the highest level of volumetric completion. And that's how I was confident that, measure system was accurate.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Mila. This is a great conversation and great presentation. One of the things that, one of the reports that we all discuss all the time is the first McKinsey report from 2017, which looked at not just offsite, but productivity across the construction sector, and compared it to other industries, but particularly manufacturing. And it's interesting because one of the things that Ryan and I noticed in our work with industry, and also part of my doctoral work at Harvard, was looking at the culture of data, and that the culture of data and the culture of productivity and the culture of continual improvement are deeply built into the manufacturing sector, and they have been for a century. But when you were, so in the companies that you visited, did you find a culture of data? And how good was that data? Because you were, in a way, to measure productivity, we need data, but also were those companies, were you the sole voice of data, or was data a part of, was there a value to data in these companies? I mean, across the ones that you looked at, how does construction, even offsite construction, look at data as a value or as a nuisance or as, a researcher topic? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly spot on as a question. So yeah, I think it's quite interesting. It seemed to be that, almost in factories with a relatively high level of automation, that's where they really get embedded into the data, or that semi-automated equipment. So they do have the statistics of how many panels, etc., they can produce. And that comes just from having to design the manufacturing line in terms of having that theoretical ultimate high capacity. And then, they typically work at about 80% of maximum capacity, so we could work that out. You know, I did also notice that some of the smaller companies actually had a really good lean management system. So even though the data wasn't necessarily very digital, it was very transparent, very easy to see, and very easy to retrieve. So I was actually quite impressed with that low tech, you know, solution to data management as well. And specifically, they're not included, you know, in my study, but especially Maka construction up north in Inverness, you know, we're very good at that. And there's other companies as well. I think that in the factory, and regardless of whether they had, you know, almost manual data, or whether it was very automated based on the computers, data was a benefit to the business, and they used the data quite a lot to plan out their production process, of course. But on site, completely different story, like complete nuisance of in terms of, no, not so much nuisance, but I'm sure, you know, I'm sure that not all my questions were very welcome when everybody had 100 other things to manage, and deliveries being late, etc. And I do know of, for example, one of my students works in a company while studying, and they've got this new great waste management data, etc. Really well set up. Nobody uses it, nobody inputs into it, etc. So I did see, you know, those different mindsets from the factory to the building sites.
But it's fascinating that you brought up, you know, two typologies of companies that you saw that had data. One was already automated companies where there's a big cost and not tracking data, but also the equipment itself lends itself to data collection. And then but on the other side of the extreme, that we saw some smaller companies, let's say maybe because the intimacy of the relationship between workers, or just because of the need to compete at a small scale, also practicing a kind of high organization, even if automation isn't there. And that's I guess that's what I'm trying to understand. When we all visited, the three of us visited Bensonwood, one of the things we found fascinating about Bensonwood is that it's a great example of both of your models, in the sense that it's a small, let's say, company that was very organized before it automated, right? Didn't skip the step from a lack of data culture to an automation culture. It went from convention, or almost even, offsite construction, but very, very basic, to a kind of organizational culture where data collection, even without automation, seemed like a big part. And that seemed to build the culture and the foundation, not just for automation, but for making decisions about automation. So I guess that's sort of fascinating to see that play itself over time. And that's a culture that the construction industry doesn't really, even the offsite industry may not be reluctant to do. But what if you have to tell people, like, what, I mean, are there things that you can point to in terms of the value of data? I mean, is it just the obvious ability of knowing how productive you are, or are there other things that, or what you see as obstacles to that kind of data culture in construction or offsite construction?
Yeah, so I think that, in terms of the application, I would definitely just plan ahead for the future, because you know, how can you plan without having that solid data is your baseline from which you can build upon. So I think that's why I was quite impressed in Bensonwood, for example. I think they were taking the time to figure out how to use the equipment quite efficiently, so they were not trying to rush through it, you know, to use it as soon as possible, but more, let's figure it out, let's understand how it will benefit us, and then make a plan based upon that. And I think that was a really good example, you know, of data being used to create a business plan. But in terms of challenges to data creation, I think it could almost be like too much data, you know, because very often you get these, even if I haven't seen them personally, I bet that from all this equipment you get so much output and so many graphs and so many charts, you don't even know which one to look at and which one means something. And you know, what do these numbers actually mean? If something tells you you're doing 100%, you know, does that mean you're doing well? Does that mean there's room for improvement? Can you go to 120? You know, so almost that oversaturation of data, and it has to do with the age that we live in as well, this internet age. So probably, you know, from those, let's say 11 categories identified, if you probably choose 2 or 3 that are quite important and have the metrics to back it up, and just focus on that, is probably the way to overcome the challenge.
Oh, that's great. And I think what Ivan's getting at is, are there tactical ways that companies can start implementing data management, data gathering and data management in an effective way? Ivan and I, and I'm sure including yourself, Mila, since you're in the productivity area, really feel that for construction sector to become a construction industry and truly industrialize, we need data, right? We need real data, and we need to analyze that data. Whether that work is done offsite or whether that work is done on site, we have to take that data so we can continuously improve and make this sector and industry and truly industrialize. I think that's the next step. Do you have any hints or any predictions for how the construction industry can change its culture to begin to collect data and analyze that data on a company scale, but also, you know, writ large, so that there can be some true improvement made across the entire sector?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. I guess that's kind of the opportunity we've got at the moment. The construction industry is being disrupted, so the vision is almost that we will become a little bit more digitized, as well as almost leaner in the future, purely out of necessity, etc. But I think what I've seen is working quite well in terms of actually extracting useful data and becoming a really data-centered operation is choosing the tools very carefully, all the software tools, and working with the software developers to make them custom to that company. So the best example I can give is, I think, Canary Wharf contractors in London who participated in the Offsite Ready project. The person's name is Roman Baron. So he showed us, all the great tools that they're using. It's central London, so better tech than I've seen anywhere else. But they had the system where, so to give an example, 360 cameras in each room or in each apartment, take a photo every week, and then analyze that photo using artificial intelligence and tell you where you are in that plot, in that apartment or that room, relevant to the Gantt chart. And you can also use that for quality control and fixing snags, etc. So I think the more we take away the pain from it, and I think that all these artificial intelligence, etc. Systems, the more you remove the need for us to communicate via email and all these, almost painstaking items, the better it will get.
Mila, thank you for joining ModX Network Voices today and sharing your PhD, your knowledge you've gained about productivity, and also your new project, Offsite Ready, which is a training program. We're going to put both those links also in the YouTube comments so people can go to them and find you. Again, thanks for joining us, and all the best.
That's great. Thanks. Thank you so much. Real pleasure. And yeah, I loved all the technical questions. Thank you so much.